Welcome back, everyone. In today's episode of Dracula, a Reader's Guide, we're going to be exploring Bram Stoker's novel in the context of Gothic literature. And to do that, I'm going to be focusing mainly on the first part of the novel in which Jonathan Harker visits Castle Dracula and discovers the truth about the Count. To me, this is one of the best parts of the novel, and it's the part of the novel that really shows exactly what kind of Gothic novel Dracula is. First, I think that what Stoker does really effectively in this first part is that he brings together two distinctive styles of Gothic literature, these being the terror style of Gothic and the horror style of Gothic. Second, we'll look at the way that Stoker builds tension and fear through each chapter in this part of the book. We'll see how every chapter ends with Harker just that little bit more afraid and slowly becoming more and more trapped by the Count and his brides. We'll also explore the differences between those two types of Gothic that I mentioned, these being horror and terror, and the way that Stoker integrates both styles in this first part of the book. And I'll show how, by combining these two Gothic styles, Stoker creates a novel that is not only unique, but in my view even better than what any novel can do by just focusing on one of those styles alone. Part 1. Gothic literature, terror and horror. When it comes to traditional Gothic horror, there are typically two main traditions that people focus on. These two styles can be described as Gothic terror and Gothic horror. The distinction was made first by Anne Radcliffe, who is one of the founding mothers of Gothic literature and arguably the actual creator of the genre, especially of the terror style. Here's what Radcliffe said about what the distinction means. Terror expands the soul and awakens the faculties to a high degree of life. Horror, in contrast, freezes and nearly annihilates them. The famous critic of Gothic literature, de Van der Varma, writes in his book The Gothic Flame, "The difference between terror and horror is the difference between awful apprehension and sickening realization, between the smell of death and stumbling against a corpse." Another big difference between the two styles that Radcliffe mentions is that terror writing connects us to the notion of the sublime, whereas horror does not. The sublime is a special form of beauty, and the term originated in the work of Edmund Burke. The sublime describes an overwhelming kind of beauty, even a terrible kind of beauty. We find it by looking out at vast mountainscapes, or out into the ocean when there's a storm, or maybe even in an incredibly rugged, powerful-looking person. Greek athletes would be a good example of that. The sublime is both attractive but also threatening, and terror for Radcliffe is the result of coming into contact with the sublime. Radcliffe's writing is, like I said, very much firmly in the terror camp. In her novels, like The Mysteries of Udolpho, most of the fear comes either from the unseen or from nature itself. There isn't much in the way of bloody, violent murder in Radcliffe's work, and when there are things like that, it's always under the surface, it's always hidden. In fact, much of the fear of the characters is more based on the unseen and their speculations and paranoia about what is really going on. Radcliffe also relies on a lot of tension building by these long descriptions of nature. Her work contains these long passages of elaborate description, with her characters exploring mountains and forests, which are both beautiful and terrible at the same time, and which isolate the characters and sometimes increase their paranoia, but also sometimes their sense of beauty, showing this duality of the sublime. On the other end of the spectrum, you have the likes of Matthew Gregory Lewis. In his novel The Monk, we have a perfect encapsulation of the horror style. Here you have a much more explicit and visual form of Gothic writing. Lewis not only gives you vivid descriptions of violence and blood, but he also uses the supernatural, whereas Radcliffe pretty much focuses always on the natural and even natural explanations. A lot of time in Radcliffe's work, and this is one criticism of her work, is that she oftentimes explains away a lot of the supernatural things with naturalistic explanations, and sometimes those make sense, and sometimes they're a little bit convoluted. Another big difference between Lewis and Radcliffe, and arguably horror and terror, is the sexual side of the works as well. While Radcliffe does touch on sexual themes, it's all very, very under the radar and not very important, whereas for Lewis, sexuality is a big theme of his work. In The Monk, the lead character falls in love for a sexually ambiguous demon named Matilda, who first appears as a beautiful boy, which the monk likes, before turning into a beautiful woman later. So why am I talking about all of this? Well, because in my view, what makes Dracula such a perfect Gothic novel is that it fuses together these two styles of writing, rather than just focusing on one element. And it does this in what I think is the best part of the book, which is the opening chapters in which Jonathan goes to Castle Dracula and meets his doom. Part 2. From Terror to Horror, Jonathan Harker's Descent. When we meet Jonathan for the first time, he's a self-assured, rational, level-headed English gentleman. He's enamoured by the new culture that he's engaging with in Transylvania, but at the same time he's also quite patronising and condescending towards the people and their superstitions when they freak out when he tells them where he's going. It's also ironic because at one point he says that he must ask the Count about these silly superstitions. Harker also has, at least initially, positive reactions to the sublime nature around him in Transylvania. And actually he uses the beauty of these landscapes to find solace and peace from the superstitions that are starting to niggle at him as he's travelling towards the Count. I soon lost sight and recollection of ghostly fears in the beauty of the scene as we drove along. But throughout this chapter, the sublime nature of the landscape becomes even grander and starts to have a darker effect on Harker as he approaches the Count. And so, as night falls and Jonathan finds himself higher in the Carpathian Mountains, just 2 pages after the part where he found solace in nature, he says, "And we wound on our endless way, and the sun sank lower and lower behind us. The shadows of the evening began to creep around us. It began to get very cold, and the growing twilight seemed to merge into one dark mistiness. The gloom of the tree, oak, beech, and pine threw in the valleys which ran deep between the spurs of the hills as we descended through the pass. The dark firs stood out here and there against the background of late living snow." So this is terror writing at its peak. Like Radcliffe, Stoker is using sublime terror of nature to scare Jonathan. By the end of the chapter, when Jonathan pulls up at the castle, you already get a sense that he is imprisoned, and this is before he's even met the Count. "Suddenly, I became conscious of the fact that the driver was in the act of pulling up the horses in the courtyard of a vast ruined castle, from whose tall black windows came no ray of light, and whose broken battlements showed a jagged line against the moonlit sky." I absolutely love that final line. It makes the castle seem like it's one of the dark mountains, jagged and cutting across the sky. Throughout this chapter then, you have this wonderful descent from beautiful landscapes in which Jonathan can find solace, to foreboding landscapes, danger, and a complete isolation as we approach the castle. At the end, there's so much tension, and pretty much nothing has happened yet outside of this journey. All of this is very much in the terror tradition of the Gothic. The focus here is on psychology, of the environment, and darkness and nature, rather than on explicit displays of horror. Chapter 2 continues to ramp up this tension. The first chapter ends with Jonathan trapped in nature, trapped up in the mountains with no one to help him, completely dependent on the Count. Now in this chapter, his prison gets even smaller as he is trapped within the castle. Stoker uses lots of repeated words and phrases to describe the castle, and these are very effective in really conveying the sense of restriction and isolation that Jonathan is feeling. He describes it as frowning. He talks about how it is impenetrable to all the senses, so dark that it lets in no light or colour, and the walls so thick that no sound can get through. These repeated phrases and ideas just keep everything tense, even in the scenes when Jonathan is a bit calm, like when he meets the Count for the first time. 2 big things happen to Jonathan in this chapter. First, he finds himself incapable of finding solace in the beauty of nature as his anxieties increase. So already the sublime has turned into something terrible rather than beautiful for Jonathan. And secondly, after a few dark encounters with the Count, he realises that he's pretty much imprisoned in this castle as well as in the mountains. This castle is a veritable prison, and I am a prisoner. Put these 2 together then, and you have a double entrapment. Trapped by nature, trapped by the castle. And in chapter 3, he'll come to be trapped by the vampires. So chapter 3 marks the real transition, I think, from terror to horror. In 1 and 2, the focus is on the environment, the shadows and psychological fear. Everything is kept mysterious until now. Everything that happened in the mountains, there were lots of creepy things happening, but it was all speculation, and there could have been naturalistic explanations for what went on. Likewise in chapter 2, Jonathan does have some weird encounters with the Count, but ultimately, again, all of this could be explained away with just superstitions and different cultures. But it is in chapter 3 where Jonathan confronts the truth about Dracula and meets his brides. At this point, Jonathan is completely broken and different from the man we met in the first chapter. He becomes superstitious. He gets out the crucifix that one of the Transylvanians gave to him and uses it as an amulet for protection. He even suggests to himself that dreams are better than reality, an overturning of his past rationalist proclivities. And the chapter concludes with probably one of the most famous scenes from Dracula, which is his meeting the brides and them forcing him to confront his own repressed sexual desires. The introduction of explicit eroticism, of violence, of the supernatural, and of course the blood are all hallmarks of the horror tradition of Gothic writing. What this chapter does as well is it takes all of that terror, all of that suspense from the first two chapters and releases it in this big climax of horror. It quite literally ends with Jonathan passing out as he can't bear to watch the brides consume this baby. The final chapter of this first part of the book, which really does work like its own short, contained story, not with a very happy ending, but still a very effective short story. This chapter ties everything together. Jonathan is completely doomed. He's in 3 prisons now. He is trapped by nature, he is trapped by the castle, and now he's trapped under the spell of the 3 brides, who he calls those weird sisters, as a reference, of course, to the 3 witches of Macbeth. This part of the novel ends with Jonathan completely collapsing back into faith, religion, superstition, and fear, as he declares, "At least God's mercy is better than that of these monsters, and the precipice is steep and high." So in these 4 opening chapters, we have this wonderfully dark and slow build and release of tension. In each chapter, Jonathan becomes more and more imprisoned by his environment and by the people, or vampires rather, who trap him. But you also have Stoker utilising both terror and horror writing, bringing them together to create something that is arguably better than what either Radcliffe or Lewis did on their own. Going back to Radcliffe's distinction, in the first chapter you have this sublime terror feeling that, as she says, awakens the faculties to a high degree of life, but by the end of chapter 4, through horror, that sense, that awakening, has been completely annihilated. And this certainly seems true for Jonathan, condemned to his fate in the castle. Part 3. From Gothic grandeur to everyday Gothic. As I've said, in my view, these first 4 chapters really do make a perfect short horror story. And while the rest of Dracula is definitely interesting and worth reading, and we'll be talking much more about that today and also in future episodes, it's only really in these chapters that I think Stoker really excels within the traditional Gothic tradition, writing in these natural environments and really using the sublime in the way that Radcliffe does. If you read those really old Gothic novels, you'll find more or less all the time they always take place in the context of grand castles, in sublime and exotic environments, and they involve the nobility. You didn't really get really old Gothic novels focusing on ordinary people. And this is another way in which I think Stoker is a bit of an innovator with respect to Gothic literature. He starts with the classic Gothic setting, but for the rest of the novel, he takes that Gothic darkness and transposes it into the everyday lives of mainly middle-class Victorians in England. Stoker's moving the Gothic to more mundane settings adds even more tension now, because the Gothic is no longer confined to the nobility, but is happening to ordinary people living ordinary lives. One thing that you'll notice when Stoker moves into this more mundane setting is that most of the discussion about the sublime and those kinds of traditional Gothic themes pretty much drop out of the story. There's less of an emphasis on nature and the sublime in the way that Radcliffe and other traditional Gothic writers love to focus on. Instead, we focus on more human aspects of life and the terror within people, such as their sexual desires, for example. And we'll be looking at all of those things in future episodes. But for this episode, just thinking about the Gothic and Dracula's place within that tradition, I think that we can encapsulate it like this. We have the first part of the novel, which is kind of a love letter to those 2 classic traditions, combining both elements to create something pretty majestic. And then we have the moving away from that style, the putting it to bed and taking it into a more mundane setting and exploring how it works here for the rest of the story. So in Dracula, Stoker is not only nodding in some ways towards those traditional styles of Gothic terror and Gothic horror in the opening chapters, but he's also developing it in a few ways. Rather than taking one side of the debate and focusing exclusively on that style, he takes elements from both and combines them and plays around with them to build tension and create something that is truly terrifying. But the true horror in Dracula is that Stoker takes this horror that is isolated in this big grand castle in the middle of nowhere, and he takes it into the lives of ordinary people. Alright, that is it for this episode of Dracula, A Reader's Guide. Let me know down in the comments, what do you think of Dracula as a Gothic novel? What tradition do you see it fitting into? Do you think it fits into one more than the other? Or like me, do you think that it actually combines elements of both? And what do you think about this idea of taking that traditional Gothic theme, that Gothic style, and moving it into the lives of ordinary people? I look forward to discussing that and more with you down in the comments. Until the next episode, take care everyone. Ta-ra!